Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary as Feck, where myself, Nick, and himself,
Clive, hello.
Talk about books. And this time it's my choice, and I've chosen a book called LANARK. Here it is here, by Scottish artist, muralist, and obviously writer Alasdair Gray.
Maybe
and,
more specifically Glaswegian, right?
Yes,
Or Unthankian, I guess.
Yes. And so this is Alasdair Gray's first novel, and it was something like 30 years in the making. And it's when we get into the talking about the book proper, you'll maybe get a sense, if you haven't already read this. This is kind of two books written at two times, and then woven together to create this whole.
Right.
But
I'm thinking, just to stop you there, before we get into it too much, I think I would now suddenly like to slip into talking about dragons for 3 hours, and then go back and maybe discuss my childhood for a few hours, and then maybe come back to the film review, the book review at the end. How's that sound?
That sounds like a great idea. Take it away, Clive. I would actually, before we get on, there's a bit of a mea culpa here. I've made a promise to Clive off air, and a promise to myself that I will share with you, gentle viewers. This is the last book I'm going to do for a calendar year, so until August of next year, that I have already read. This is it's come up a few times over the course of the show we're doing, that I have chosen things that I had read earlier in my life and wanted to revisit. But I think I'm going to challenge myself, at least for the next, I guess, 25 choices or whatever it's going to be, not to do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about half a year's worth, right? Not to do anything that I've already read.
Okay, so now I guess now it's my time to announce as well that from now on, for the next, I'll be choosing a different Mr. Men book each time. So beginning with Mr. Wobbly Twat, or whatever the fuck his name is.
Mr. Tickle seemed like he would get in trouble nowadays. I think he would be cancelled very quickly.
Yes, he's a bit of a perv, isn't he? I think. Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, but I maybe I'll save where and when I read this for the first time for a bit later in the chat. I'm actually quite interested to know, Clive, what you made of this. I mean, it's a difficult book to give a plot description of. But I suppose we can have a stab at it before we get into.
Yeah, I refreshed my memory, and I can do a very, very basic kind of just the main blocks if you want me to.
Okay. Yeah.
So our main protagonist, we start with him, right? Thor, who, I don't know about you, but while reading this entire book, I had imagining a adaptation of this, I was imagining a young Peter Capaldi.
Oh yeah. I
thought it would be ideal.
He'd be great. Yeah. Although we should say we don't know his name is Thor at the beginning of the book, because at the beginning of the book his name is LANARK, as it is at the end of the book.
Oh, so sorry, I got the wrong way around. Yeah, he's LANARK to begin with, and he's a kind of he's a very socially awkward young man in seems to be a city without daylight, right? Called
Yes. Yes, yeah. That stuff is very effective. That opening part of the book, because I didn't remember much of it, although I'd read this before. I really only remembered two scenes very clearly, and as it turned out, I had misremembered both of them. We'll talk about that later on. But they had both made a strong impression on me, I thought, and then came back and was like, oh, I didn't remember that exactly how it actually plays out. But
so I'm not going to go into big detail here.
No, but I think it is worth mentioning that when the character is introduced, or at the beginning, the character doesn't really know who or what he is. He's just sort of almost woken up on this train with no real memories of a life before, although he seems to be in his 20s or something like that. He has no real memory of a life before. He just almost spontaneously generates into this dystopian, depressing, sunless world where Everyone's kind of dreary, and he kind of hangs
Glasgow.
around. Yeah, Glasgow, exactly. He hangs around cafes and has awkward interactions with women and men, and he lives in this kind of squalid little apartment building, right? And he has a landlady there, and people are disappearing. This is one element. People are just kind of randomly vanishing off the face of the earth, and this whole world seems to be shrinking in some way. This kind of strange, depressing.
Oddly enough, even though there's a much more kind of I suppose a realistic section to follow, this bit in a weird way reminded me of my like years of 16 to 19 as a kind of sixth form college student, just kind of couch surfing in the week when I wouldn't go home and just going to different people's houses and I don't know, something about it reminded me of that section of my life.
Hanging out with kind of vaguely bohemian types, you know.
Not really quite knowing what's going on, and just the opposite sex almost being like an alien race, and so it captures that mood quite nicely.
I don't know how you feel about the book overall. I mean, we'll get there, but I find like there's a part much later in the book where the author, who actually appears quite near the end of the book as a character, freaks out when the main character in the book refers to the book as being science fiction, and he's like, "It's not fucking science fiction," and I kind of enjoy that, because in a way, although it is, it also isn't. I find like it's science fiction in this, it has more to do maybe with like Dunsany and like Borges and people like that in a way, or as much to do with them as it does with, or the weirder, more cerebral end of science fiction, the Philip K. Dick kind of,
or even bits of Michael Moorcock now and again as well. It reminded me of, but what I was going to say again, just I think we're going to do this a lot because it's so vast. It's just jumping. I'm going to attempt to stay on.
It is a huge. You should know this, reader. The book is like, if you buy it in, as I originally did, I bought it for a university course. I was terrified when I went into the university bookshop and found the copies of it, because it is like a doorstopper, 600-700 page long.
And it's dense as well, right? It's not. But I think this is what's going to happen. Is something, you're going to say something is going to trigger something, and then I'll say it. But anyway, Sugar Knight, that's how it's going to go. I think. So, but one thing I did appreciate about the novel actually is in the, especially when you're reading something from the mid, kind of mid 20th century, where some of these things haven't necessarily become cliches yet, and they later would. It's always on the, he's this kind of very awkward chap, right? The LANARK of the early, and I was always scared it was going to tip over, because a lot of it is about him looking for unconditional love in a way. I was worried it was going to tip over into, at some point he's going to find his manic pixie dream girl, and and he will be strong and mighty and conquer the world, and spoilers, that never happens. Like, he kind of, things get worse, if anything, rather than better. I kind of appreciate that, because it wasn't just someone writing out their wish fulfillment.
I remember actually probably being thrown by that when I read it, because I read it as a young man. Like 19, right? I read this quite young.
I'm not gonna take over the universe. Shit.
No, it's really almost about the hopelessness of trying, and in that way it has elements of Kafka in there. I mean, this is all good. There's lots of stuff, and he's drawn from so many things, but this is the first book I'd ever read that includes a dictionary or whatever it is, or an index of plagiarism.
That's a nice touch. But
I've never seen it.
This opening section is probably the most Kafka-like of the it's Glasgow as a early 20th century Prague, isn't it?
But you know what's funny? I read this at 19, and then And then I watched many years later that Alex Proyas film, Dark City.
Yeah.
But never connected it in my mind to this. But then upon rereading the opening sections, I was like, oh shit, I wonder how much of Dark City's,
Good call. Yeah, I hadn't put
DNA
those two
comes from
together, but
this.
yes, you're absolutely right. There is something very unthunk about Dark City, a film I haven't seen in many years, but I remember really liking.
I saw it not that long ago for the first time, actually,
okay.
and I liked it a lot, and I was surprised. It was one of those things that like maybe Roger Ebert had always said was like the best film of that year, and I was always like, really? Why, the guy who directed The Crow? All right, and then yeah, coming back to it.
There's nothing wrong with the original Crow. I think it's just been spoilt by
No,
the fandom, I think, more than
another mea culpa would be that I saw that film 11 times in the cinema, and that may be why I have
11 times.
I was a big fan of the graphic novel by James O'Barr, and it became a bit of an obsession for me at the time. But therefore, I watched it to death, and now it's hard for me to.
Slight tangent, because I suspect you're probably not ever going to choose it for Products, Comics to Alex, but how does the film stack up to the comic?
The book is quite a bit darker, and the ending is. It's definitely, it comes from a place of even more maybe despair, and it's not quite as actiony. And then one thing that I found frustrating about the film was the addition of the whole idea that like the crow is his soul, and somehow like kill the crow and you kill the man. None of that's in the book. Like there wasn't. He didn't have this weird Achilles heel that they obviously that was written for. It's much more of a straight revenge story. It's just the supernatural thing hunting down these scumbags one by one and executing them.
The film sounds almost like you'd probably enjoy it more if you didn't have.
Yeah, probably.
It reminds me a little bit of. I remember first, as if we didn't have enough to talk to, but I remember seeing From Hell when it came out in the theater, and actually quite enjoying it because it was. It was grisly, the usual kind of Hollywood, because it was a pretty big movie, right? They gave the brothers, and I thought, oh, this is, for a mainstream kind of film, this is, and then going back and reading the graphic novel, and then watching the film again, I was like, oh my god, they've thrown out all the really interesting stuff. There's nothing left in that film, going way down in my estimation. Which, I don't know if that's fair or not, because on the one hand it worked as a film before, but then on the other hand they clearly did know what was in the source material and they made the choice not to do it. So anyway,
so back,
which is perfect for this book, actually.
Exactly. So he's there, and life is going from bad to worse, and then basically as I said, people are disappearing off the face of the earth in this kind of mysterious and unknown way. And then ultimately, I can't even remember why he ends up, but basically it almost becomes an act of volition. You can choose to leave this world when you get frustrated or upset or whatever enough, right? Almost by jumping through the gullet of some kind of whatever the fuck it is.
Yeah, but some kind of weird chute or something that it's important that you're naked when you go through as well or something, right? Because things might fuse with you. And, and you're supposed to go head first. He ends up in the next part of this book, which is some sort of
the Institute, right? Hospital-y kind of place.
And it seems like outside of this institute, which is always mutating and changing as well, apparently, when you look out the window, like you're not quite sure what you're going to see. Plus as well, I couldn't quite tell, sometimes it seems as if you can just see through walls, and then sometimes you can't, and people he's known in the other world are in this world, but one of them's now an elevator, and
yes, Gloopy, who had been somebody he'd met, so sometimes when you enter this world, and I guess we completely forgot to mention one of the things that I really like about that opening section is that there's a series of maladies that people are suffering from, and Lanark's own malady is he's slowly growing a lobster arm as the book goes, this part of the book goes on. He's developing this outer
dragon hide, right?
It's called dragon hide, but basically he's developing an exoskeleton, right? and other characters developing all of these mouths in her body that are all speaking with the voice of her like slightly abusive boyfriend, and so they all seem to be related to their obviously their emotional state or whatever. In LANARK's case, he's literally trying to build a suit of armor around himself because he doesn't trust people, and he's trying to put you know, he's squishy on the inside, so he needs to develop, and so he literally is. So all these people's neuroses and kind of illnesses are manifesting physically, and then when they go through to this institute, there's the possibility of being cured, and so he is cured, right? And this part he talks about, that Alasdair Gray talks about, that this is all borrowed from like the Bible, like Jonah and the whale, this idea of the symbolic thing of being swallowed and rebirthed, basically. So you know, yeah, that is rebirth. And he goes to work for the institute, which has this weird doctor Ozen, as a doctor, and there's a kind of an overseeing doctor, Dr. Ozenfant, if that's how you say his name. And this is where we discover that some of the people who are there are not going to be cured, but in fact will go through this catastrophic catalytic event where they will go thermonuclear, and the energy from this is then used to power the
Soylent Green is people.
Yes.
Well,
he didn't mention that in his index of plagiarisms, actually. But yes, and yeah, basically that the food there is generated partly out of these these people who are the people who don't survive.
You remind me as well about like the body horror aspect as well. While reading this, and I don't know if there was any connection, a couple of weeks ago, I freaked me and my wife out a little bit when I woke up one morning and the bottom half of my bed was covered in like spots of dried blood, and I'd in my sleep I'd been scratching my feet with together like the nails,
right,
till I drew blood, and there was quite a bit of blood at the bottom of my bed.
You might want to clip your toenails, Clive.
They were quite long.
Or get those little gloves they have for babies to stop them from scratching their faces. Maybe you get some little booties.
Not a bad idea. They would suit me, I think, as well. Kinky boots. So and also the other one is so mention this dragon hide. There's a young woman who might be some kind of version of Rima, right? For the girl he kind of had a thing for, who is literally turning into a dragon. It seems, she's also going to go full thermonuclear, right? And they're like, okay, we can't cure her. Stand back. And somehow and again, these were the bits where I was scared it was going to go Pixie Dream Girl. But again, I mean, no, because she's not in any way thankful for having been saved, right?
Yes. Yep.
She's a great protagonist, actually, when we get her, because she totally matches him just in terms of her utter kind of selfishness and inability to connect, or
totally focused on her own needs, and
but also it's slightly better at articulating why
she's honest,
annoying as he is.
She's honest about it, and she feels rightfully that he's not, that he goes through a bunch of mental gymnastics in a way to make himself the good guy, even though at no point in either of the two narratives that he's the protagonist in, right, as we discover in a moment when we get to the middle chunk of this book, that he's a dick. And this is one of the things that, coming back to it as an adult, or that really changed for me, was how much I identified with Lanark and Duncan, because my identification with them was quite strong when I read this as a 19-year-old at art school, and then coming back to it now, I was like, oh, what a dick. Wow.
Because I mean, just by definition, if you were a 19-year-old in art school, you would have been a dick, right?
Yeah, you are certainly, you would have been a dick, and and all of the stuff. I mean, well, okay, we'll hang on, we'll get there. So basically, he does save Rima, as you said, by kind of talking her back from the brink of basically by agreeing to sacrifice his life. If she's going to go thermo, he's going to be there with her, and she kind of de-escalates, much to the annoyance of everyone at the institute, who was really banking on whatever gigawatts of energy she was about to produce.
And to her annoyance as well, actually.
Yeah.
It's almost like he takes away. It's a way of reading it. It's not selfless, selfless, because he's kind of taken away what could be considered maybe an act of suicide or something that would take away her pain. But he's kind of made it all about him, and now she has to carry on living, and she has to carry on living with this very annoying man who's So there's a lot of different ways you can take it, right?
Agree.
And I doubt Alasdair Gray has a hard and fast kind of take on it himself, right?
No, in fact, as you described, I think one of the most beautiful images is when he's looking out the windows of the Institute, and it's almost just like, to coin an H.P. Lovecraft, right? Like non-Euclidean geometry, like where everything's overlapping and everything's at the wrong angles, and there's like things that should be in the foreground or in the background, and the mountains are all kind of piled on top of each other.
Right.
And it's beautifully strange, and you get the sense that he's seeing it like refracted through some sort of giant prism, and he's seeing aspects of all these landscapes kind of mashed together. But you're right, in that way the book itself lends itself to, well, I mean, I read it at 25-year interval or whatever, and it's a totally different book when you read it.
It's interesting, as if the Institute is somehow almost oddly outside of it. It almost seems like it's in that like that place where the Tesseract in Interstellar is, or something like that. Right?
Yes.
Like it connected to everything, but also somehow outside of it, but linked somehow. Anyway.
So at this point, somehow he gets in touch with this thing called the Oracle. He's reached this point where he wants to know who he is, because he doesn't have any memories before waking up on this train in Unthank. And so the Oracle proceeds to give him a story of who he may have been. And then we get effectively. So another thing, when you first read this, especially when you're 19 and you've been assigned this for a university course, and you begin and you're like, wait, book 3? Why am I reading book 3? Have I misunderstood something? Was I supposed to buy another book? And then you read to the end of book 3 and you get to book 1. So the book is out of order in terms of what you would expect it to be. And yet, partly then, I guess Alasdair Gray said, upon finishing the book, he realized it could be he liked. So my plan is, if I ever read this again, and I maybe will come back if I'm alive in 25 years to do it again, is to read it 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I don't know if it would work, really.
I'm not sure if it would either.
There's something about it's funny. There's something about this. So there's a certain type of, there's other books like this I can think of as well, where I can't figure out if it's a cheat, and just reorganizing something makes something straightforward more interesting. And it's case by case. So in the case of this book, I think it's not because it seems just to have come fully organic out like that, right? Like, it's not someone trying, I don't think there's anything. I have problems with it, but I don't think it's a cynical book. Do you know what I mean?
No.
I remember reading like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, which they also did a film, if you remember, with lots of Tom Hanks in yellowface makeup. But Cloud Atlas is a book made of segments from several books, basically.
Right.
Each one kind of a pastiche of a different, type of book. And the thing is, each one is actually very enjoyably readable. But the fact that he just presents almost fragments, it means he cleverly doesn't have to bother thinking of an ending for any.
Right.
So even though I enjoyed reading Cloud Atlas, by the end I was thinking, hang on now, like
right.
But I did enjoy reading it, so that's so it's difficult to I'm not quite sure, but there's something to be said for sometimes obfuscating things, making them seem a little bit more interesting than if they were straightforward they might not.
Right.
But that in itself might be a clever trick like a magician or something would do and is valid. I don't know.
I mean, in this case, so we know because he's really honest about it that the the middle section of this book is another book in a way. It's a book he wrote before, right? It's a book he wrote, spent many years working on, and it is in some ways, a straightforward, semi-autobiographical Bildungsroman. The story of a young man who finds his way in the world, although in this case doesn't have much of a happy ending. And over time, he made this decision to kind of graft it or to expand it into this whatever the hell LANARK is, right? And I remember at the time reading it that first time, really liking the middle of the book and being like, this is the book. And like these chunks on the either side are okay, whatever. I didn't dislike them, but I felt like this is the book.
The meat of the, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know that I fully feel that way this time. I have more time and I'm more interested in what he was attempting to do than the first time, where I really felt like, okay, this is a really interesting book. And I almost felt like, I think, and other people who've read it too, felt like this should have been 2 books. Like this would be a great
first time reading
of the artist as a young man kind of a thing.
I definitely enjoyed this section more.
Yeah, I would agree. I still think it's overall better, but I have more sympathy than I did then. I was more annoyed by the book the first time I read it than I was this time.
It didn't annoy me, maybe because I was somewhat braced, so I knew it was going to happen as well. Like I knew it was going to do this weird dimension jumping thing.
Right.
Had I gone into it not knowing, I can imagine it might have been a slightly, I didn't get to reach my happy finish for that midsection, and suddenly you're off doing something else, right? You could get literary blue balls, I guess, from this, because none of the I don't know. I mean, the Bildungsroman stuff, I suppose you could say, is more or less tied up. Like I can't see many other places that it would have gone. I think you basically get the story right. So I didn't necessarily feel as if I was deprived of.
Well, no, it very much has its own beginning, middle, and an end, and it does. It echoes, as I said, I saw more the way that the books had been tied together in ways that were satisfying to me this time, whereas I mostly felt the disconnect the first time I read it.
Yeah. I suppose it isn't clearly delineated; it's kind of smudged a little bit, so you don't really have a chance to think about it until you look back, and then maybe I suppose that had run its course. Just I didn't get a kind of full stop at the end. So because before you know it, which is testament to the book as well, that when it does switch, you don't necessarily you don't stop, or I didn't stop like it kind of flowed into the next section, and each time I put it down, picked it up again, I never remembered what just happened.
Right.
Because I can't remember, and it didn't really matter either. I just because you get straight back into it. You don't need a run up, right? You just it is almost a book that you have to dive in at the deep end without fear, really, I think.
There's a great comment by somebody who basically said that if this book had gone unpublished, it would be one of those like things that's talked about like a great work of madness. You know what I mean? Like a Darger, kind of a thing. Like it's just this epic, massive, crazy thing, and that it could have just been because what was interesting to me about watching the documentary was it really made me realize how much of that midsection of the book really was drawn. From life, like that. He talks in the documentary a little bit about obviously I played with certain things and I made things grimmer than they were, right? Like he kind of removes all the joy from his childhood and his young years in this version, but basically the events of Alasdair Gray's life and the events of Duncan Thaw's life mostly line up, to the point where I was blown away that later on when he does there's that extended piece quite near the end where he paints that mural in the church that all of that was exactly pretty much how it had played out in real life.
Right.
Right down to, I thought, well, he must have, he couldn't have actually dropped out of art school at the end of his 4th year, because he decided to go do this. But apparently that's exactly what happened. So he does seem to be properly.
That stuff did ring true. It's interesting as well, actually, when you see the doc and you see him, he's such at least at this, well, the doc's called Alasdair Great 80, right? So he's getting on a bit. He's dead now. But it's interesting how well adjusted he actually seems. Like, he's like a very cheery kind of
dapper,
with
dapper
a very
gentleman,
lovely kind of sing-songy. But like, you could hear, like, even when what he was saying wasn't necessarily that much of interest to me. Just the way he was saying it was quite nice to hear, right? And it's funny because I mean, if you were to go by the book, it almost seems like at a certain point, like he's developing schizophrenia or something. Like he's really going off the deep end and kind of being led by voices or something that no one else is privy to at all, and getting almost like the margin of pleasure that he's getting from the chaos of the rest of his life gets slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer, right? Towards the end, and it's quite painful in a way to read, right? And there's certainly no kind of joie de vivre of like, well, I'm nuts, but at the end of the day, no.
It's not like
be
on
not
a lust for life
and happy than
It's not that Van Gogh lust for life kind of like.
Oh, the other thing I was thinking of is the agony and the ecstasy, right?
Yes,
that kind of thing. No. There's none of that. It's very much the flip side in a way. Like there's no, not even once is there a retreat into, well, at least I have my work, which is great or something. No. He's very kind of
the scenes of him reworking the mural over and over again in trying to attain something. It's very real. It's very real to anyone who's worked on a piece of art.
And it's madness. It's Sisyphean madness as well, right?
Yes.
There's no satisfactory conclusion.
I love in the documentary when you realize like that's still going on. Like they're talking to his poor assistant who's trying not to say what he clearly wants to say, which is like, oh my God, working with this man is,
and a quick aside as well, did you notice that bit where he's got it all laid out on the table? And did you notice there's like a guy standing on the table with a cigarette, like looking? I thought, fuck, that's a young LANARK. That's a young LANARK right there.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, maybe we'll very, very briefly explain what happens in books 2 and 3. Is that we go right back to the beginning of a character who probably is LANARK in another life, a character called Duncan Thaw. We go right basically to the very beginning of his life, and we follow him through childhood, and he has these kind of incredible, like, hysteric tantrums, right? And it is to the point where his mom and dad have to like immerse him in freezing cold water to kind of calm him down. He develops
called having a bath in Glasgow.
Yes, in Glasgow. Yes, exactly. And he also has like terrible asthma, right, which causes him to feel like he's suffocating. So this is kind of another thing he lives in. Yeah, and he's just growing up in Glasgow in the immediate post-war. And maybe is there some of it that takes place during the war?
Yes, yeah,
right.
Because he's evacuated to the country, right?
Yes, and it turns out not to have lions, witches, or wardrobes in it. But yeah, so we follow him through childhood, and there's some great stuff at the beginning, like just little images of him like walking around in these estates and like talking to like older kids, and then I really enjoyed all that detail. There's real granular grit, I think, about growing up in
I rather than Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, I would say a mangy cat, old crone, and a worm-ridden sideboard.
Yes, that sounds about right.
C.S.
And
Lewis is less popular follow-up to Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
yeah, yeah. So it was a little grim. And then and so yeah, he grows up and he has this increasingly intense negative relationship with his sister, who I like the fact that she shows up in the documentary to also basically tell you, like, yeah, that's all basically true. He was not an easy person to live with.
Very well-adjusted and cheerful, and
oh yeah, and it was clear even in the Duncan Thaw section that he kind of, as as she gets older, she figures out her life, and she's obviously on a better path than he is. And so yeah, and then the mum dies, and that's again all seems to be drawn from life, and his sister actually says in the documentary that was exceedingly hard for her to read, because it dredges up a lot of pain. And then he goes to art school, right? So there's like a lengthy part of him kind of interacting with different students, and some of the stuff I liked the most in this section is basically, his coming to through adolescence, right? The book is fairly honest about jerking off, and in fact, at one point he has these like terrible asthma attacks that can be somehow relieved slightly through jerking off, which is kind of interesting. Thank God I've never suffered from asthma. This book really makes it seem like something that would suck.
Right. Well, it's interesting. There's something about this book as well where, because I think if you've never suffered, because I've known various people, I've grown up with various people over the years who, through some kind of malady or something, they're kind of a little bit fragile. For some reason, I always think of what's his name, the guy who plays music as Dorothy Column. I always think, someone like that, someone kind of very, very, very kind of fragile, right? And I think if you've been lucky enough to have never had anything like that in your life, it's even the most tolerant person at a certain point finds themselves, thinking, is that person just a malingerer? Are they, right. Are they, and what I think is really good in this book is Alasdair Gray is obviously kind of, he's second guessing himself, right? There's a lot of stuff about how all of this might be
psychosomatic. Yep.
But then also, yes, like you said, you do feel the how real it feels, even if it is. It doesn't matter, because the end result is still as potent as if it was.
Yeah, I mean, he ends up in hospital
because everything happens inside your head, right? When people say, "Oh, it's all in your head," you're thinking, "Well, everything's all in my head. It's all in your head. Everything we've ever done is all in your head, right?" So. I think it does quite a good job of that. On the one hand, he's certainly not overly sympathetic with himself for sure, but also at the same time, you don't full hate our protagonist either. You do relate. You can relate.
That's what was interesting this time, because his like absolute sense of like self-righteousness, and like all the stuff about his poor dad who's like paying for him to go to school and the rest of it, and he's just never seems to really appreciate the sacrifices that are being made for him, and the accommodations that are constantly being made for him by other people, like by his sister, by his father, by his professors, by his teachers. People are constantly bending over backwards to accommodate his oddness, that he's a difficult person, right? That now he's clearly talented, and this comes through, right? But he's given outrageous leeway during his time at school, right? And again, I mean, he's outraged when his dad suggests that maybe he get a part-time job or something to kick in some money, and all, you're like, what fucking dude?
But there's also something admirable about it, right? Because he's so like, no, well, I just want to do whatever the fuck I want all the time, and then create art when the mood strikes me. That's it. I'll
That's
be
it.
honest with you, that's it, and anything else, and even that actually, when giving it to me, is not going to make me happy. Like,
Yes.
so,
Yeah, yeah.
and you wonder, like, well, actually, which way, actually, would it be worse in that case for you to just go and work in the post office, or would it actually be, would you be happier maybe with a bit of
That's a nice connection to make.
discipline?
That's a great connection, just because it immediately brings to mind Bukowski and
Right. I mean, when you read, he seems almost the happiest when he worked in the post office, right? When he was doing
right.
the thing he didn't want to do that got in the way of his writing, and then and certainly his writing was like the more indulged he got, like less
no. The grist, he needed that grist for the mill for sure. He needed that sense of of soul death to be able to throw it all on the page. And we definitely see that here. And I think I lost what I was going to say, but basically, I mean, I was just interested in the documentary that's all kind of came through loud and clear that no, that really is just what Alasdair Gray clearly was like and is like.
But again, I mean, if we can compare, I mean, who knows how much he might have changed over the years. I mean, I suspect not that much, because you see some archive footage of him when he was younger, and he still seems to have that quite jolly demeanor. So actually, the Thor, the LANARK of the book, is actually quite different from, because Alasdair Gray seems so much more likable and cheery and fun to be in. Now, I'm not saying he was like that all the time.
But that is a him post that book being published, and post him becoming a cult celebrity, and post him getting some of the accolades he clearly thought he deserved. I love that part in the documentary too, where he says I had planned to write LANARK, to be basically it's like this, it's like whenever Johnny fucking Rotten talks about how, Never Mind the Bollocks was supposed to be the end of rock and roll. Like, it was going to be the definitive statement. There should have been no rock and roll music made after the album, Never Mind the Bollocks. And in the same way, he's kind of like, no, this was going to be. And then I was going to write a book of the greatest poems ever seen by man. Right. And then I was going to write a collection of plays, which would be the end of a play, as we know, And I'm like, I can totally see that. I can totally see Alasdair Gray having this plan, and then it ending up. And we'll talk about this later. I'm very interested in reading at least 2 of his other books now, based on.
The one I definitely want to read is the Greek director Yorgos Lanthimos, who made Killing of a Sacred Deer, Dogtooth, and of course won. Did he win an Oscar for The Favourite? Right.
Okay.
His next film is an adaptation of Poor Thing, I think it's called.
Yes, that one, and 1982 Justine is the other one, because that's apparently his pornographic book. And I'm quite interested, because this book, it teeters on the edge of that slightly, but
I agree with you. I'd like to see him indulge that part of him a bit and see where.
Apparently, that's exactly what that book is. He just went full on.
Right, and that's
I'm sure. You couldn't have not noticed. This is what I was going to say before. Speaking of people who are just like, I'm going to do what I want to do. The part where he talked about his first wife, the whatever she was, the Danish or whatever teenager that he married, and then basically was like, well, she basically just left me to do what I wanted to do, and that was great. That was the perfect relationship. It was like, I got to do my writing and my painting, and she never asked where the food money was going to come from.
It didn't last.
Not forever.
No. So there's that part. So, and then we get the final segment, right? And this is the part I think that played least well with me, I think.
Okay. Can I anticipate? Maybe.
Well, I was just going to say what it was briefly.
Okay.
Okay. So, and I'm not even exactly sure what it is, but basically we go back to the Institute, right? Because and then we remember, the Oracle is telling him all of this stuff. Yeah. So then him and Rima, or rather actually him, decide to leave the Institute, because she's quite happy there eating other people's.
Yes, Soylent Green is fine for her.
Yeah. But he seems to want to get back to Unthank, or get to some place
with sunshine, which I do understand. He is from Glasgow.
Yes.
In 2 worlds. He's from 2 versions of Glasgow. He desperately wants to get some some vitamin D happening. So he needs to get to somewhere with sun.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah, 1 minute it's all sunny, Proclaimer, sunshine on Leith, and then the rest of the time it's train spotting, right?
Yes.
But so yeah, so there's this kind of long journey through.
Yes, the intercalendrical zone.
Yeah, some sort of odd post-apocalyptic kind of it felt a little bit like they were going through like a really depressing version of the Crystal Maze or something. Like
yeah,
the shit zone, the horrible zone, fucked up zone, but without what's his face to guide you through. Richard O'Brien. Yeah, and then they end up, so they end up in a kind of and then they're reunited with all of these characters from before, right?
Yes.
And
most importantly, Sludden, right?
Who's
gone from being
nemesis, right?
Yeah, and he's gone from being kind of like the local cool guy on the coffee bar scene to now being some sort of political leader in Unthank, and he continues to be a thorn in LANARK's side.
He's what's his name? If he's Marty McFly, he's the
Biff Tannen.
Yes, there we go. Yeah.
Yes.
So even this bit is it gets increasingly fragmented, and even now and again, did you notice there's an odd section where LANARK's like speech patterns change and he starts contracting words together and I thought, oh no, is the book just gonna disintegrate into I thought that might happen, but then it pulls itself back from that a little bit. But yeah, and now we really do get into weird Michael Moorcocky kind of territory with, I mean, I don't know how much we want to go into it, but it turns into a bizarre kind of time traveling political thriller, end of the world kind of I don't know.
And meeting God, who is of course Alasdair Gray, as it turns out.
Yeah, of course he is. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know how much we want to dwell on the details of it. But,
yes.
But it does go full. I mean, it really does go to the kind of, I don't know. It's weird. It's interesting how it holds together in this really ramshackle way, because I don't really understand the physical logistics of what's happening.
No.
But somehow there's just enough of a narrative thread to pull me through, and I'm kind of, okay, I think I know where we are in time and space now, but I'm not that sure. Plus, the ground's always moving beneath your feet because there's all these kind of eco disasters happening.
Yes,
and
because it literally is moving.
Yeah.
Some points the whole landscape is just on a 45-degree angle and stuff.
Right. And then it kind of flips back to another place at the very, very end, which could either be Unthank, or it could be actually the Glasgow of the Buildings-Roman book in the far future, or some kind of weird combination of all of them, right?
Yep.
And please don't expect any sort of conclusion or tie-up or anything like that, right?
Or happy ending, for sure.
Well, the ending, I would say the ending's almost beyond. I couldn't really tell you if it was happy or sad, really. It's just
it's beyond
it's not even an ending, really.
No. It kind of tells you what's going to happen, but then doesn't show you.
One does wonder how, because I've always thought that, to your point, the greatest book ever written is probably still being written by a crazy man or woman in a shed somewhere at the bottom of the garden, just and constantly rewriting.
Well, remember Under the Volcano, right? That's pretty much
exactly.
And
they'll die, and it'll be thrown out, and then a dead dog will be thrown on top of them, and then we'll never see it again, right? But to that, I was wondering, what was the input? Because I didn't quite get this from the doc, or what actually did prevent, what managed to get Alasdair Gray to actually stop? Because it's clearly still a work in progress in a way. Like,
yes.
it's not as if he was like, aha, that's it, that's it. You know, it's
Right.
it's just like a dollop, like there you go. And I'm wondering, was it just, did someone just wrestle it away from his hand and say, Alasdair, sit down, we're going to publish? No, no, no more. No, you cannot fix that. No, like the cathedral church that he's. And so I was wondering about that. Like, how did they actually figure out? Okay, this.
But I also liked in the documentary, which is perfect, was when maybe it's Ian Rankin, but one of the other authors says like that when he finally does, and he's been writing this book for 30 years, when he finally does find a publisher willing to publish it, because it's turned down all over the place. It's turned down originally in its first form as just the story of a young artist falling to pieces, and then he expands it into this sprawling whatever the hell it is, but not a science fiction book. But then, yeah, so, you know, for various, I mean, one reason is apparently it was just so big that they were like, it's going to cost too much to print, and we're not taking a chance that nobody buys it because it's going to be too much money. I mean, it's about as big as the Spinegrinder book. In fact, I realize now, thinking about my own bookshelf, yeah, it's, you know, it's, those things cost money to print. So, but then, you know, he said like, but then he's like making these demands of the publisher, like, oh, well, I mean, because one thing that's quite famously the case, you are not allowed as an author ever to design the cover of your own book or do your own illustrations. Like that's one of those verboten things, you know, or to make demands about the font types and things like that. He was absolutely, you know, this, it must look like this, it must be this, it must be laid out like this. And they just went, all right, Alasdair, you can have your way. Yeah, but again, that single-mindedness of, but so you're right, but yeah, it could never be finished. But so I was going to mention before that so he has this list at one point in the book. He has this list of plagiarisms, right? So he calls them diff plagues, which is diffuse plagiarisms, and then there's something else. There's another term.
I do like his little abbreviated terms.
Right. And so
they were like prompt commands or something, weren't they? On the
yes. And so in the case of at one point he just basically comes out and says, well, the entire book is a diffuse plagiarism of and I can't remember the author's name, but Jen has a copy here, The Water Babies.
The Water Babies. I'm glad you brought up The Water Babies.
I was trying to find it on the bookshelf here and I can't, but she has an original old unabridged
Charles Kingsley.
Yes, yeah. And she's read it, and I remember at the time Jen was like, "This book is fucked. Like, it's really disturbing." Like, she was like, "What is this thing?"
There's some of it in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen as well. That's one of the touchstone things that it mentions quite a lot. And yeah, so I'm glad you brought up The Water Babies, actually, because The Water Babies has been something I've been wanting to.
Oh shit! Are we gonna have to do it on this show later on?
Because I don't know. Maybe it's possible. Because the thing is, the memory I have of The Water Babies is not so much reading it, but there was a film version in the 70s, which was mostly animated, but it had these live action bookend parts. And I remember catching it on television when I was a kid. I don't even know if I saw the whole thing, and I might even be remembering this incorrectly, but there's a scene at the very beginning of the film which so profoundly affected me for whatever reason, and it's a place there's certain that thing when you're walking around somewhere and you'll suddenly smell something and you'll get this olfactory thing that takes you back to a very specific place in your childhood. And it only lasts like a few seconds, right? And you're like desperately like trying to find the smell again because it's so satisfying. So a kind of a thought that I get in my head. So there's a bit at the beginning of that film where I can't remember exactly what happens, but I think there's a kid who's like running away from some horrible adults, and I suppose in the book what actually happens is he falls in a river and drowns and dies. But in the way they represent it in the book is he goes into the river and then enters this other fantasy underwater world, right? And there's a bit in the film where the child falls in the river, and he just narrowly escapes the people who are after him, and then he's in this kind of amazing technicolor underwater world, and the horrible world is just there, right? It's just about, he's just got in there safe, and I remember that just beguiling me, like,
Right. Yeah.
like, and I remember wandering around, like looking in rivers, and just something about that sense of just being safe under the rippling waters of a little stream. I don't know, one of those weird things that, and I've never even read the whole book or even seen the film all the way through, I don't think, but something about that image.
We may want to, for that reason and others. Also, apparently, it's virulently anti-Irish, so I'm quite interested in reading it for that reason.
Anti-Semitic and all sorts of good things, like so, that. Right? Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see it. But it's funny, actually. This is again another very brief aside, but I have the same experience of two different, I think, Australian-made kids TV shows that I watched as a young kid. One has a scene where a kid is out wandering in a field and basically touches like almost like a standing stone kind of a thing with like circular designs on it, and is pulled through the stone with really dodgy like CSO, early 80s effects, and into this other world. Or maybe even a hand reaches out through this stone and pulls him in, and it just completely sticks with me forever.
You never figured out what it was?
I don't even know. No, I'm sure if I Google it long enough, I can probably find it out. But it was, and then there's another one, which was based on a novel, again, either New Zealand or Australian, about these kind of Lovecraftian aliens who live under a lake and can take human form and are very, very creepy. And there's a pair of twins. And if I Google that one, I've come up, I can't remember what it's called, but it may even be, I'm confusing it now. I want to say Under the Mountain, not Under the Volcano. It's something called like Under the Mountain. But I remember watching that, and it was kind of like because it was an adaptation of a book, a novel. It was a series, but every episode directly followed on from the last one. And also really the creepy. I think my later love of Lovecraft entirely comes from that TV series.
Yeah, there's a definite period of 70s and 80s made for children kind of weird fantasy stuff, which is creepy,
which continues to haunt adults to this day.
And some of the Children's Film Foundation things as well, in a slightly different way, like the Battle for Billy's Pond and things like that. Have these kind of gothic tinges, right? Anyway, we digress. What a surprise!
Yes. It's a good book to so that anyway, Water Babies is an interesting thing, because it really does. I mean, he basically lets you know in the text that Water Babies involves a realistic narrative set in like kind of about a poor kid who, and then who dies and then is reborn in a fantasy world and has all these adventures, and these adventures that are very specifically meant to represent, because that's another, there's a lot of social criticism in the unthanked sections, especially the last chunk. As you mentioned, it gets very political. There's a big kind of multinational corporations. Capitalism is literally cannibalism. The environment is being totally degraded. I mean, I was blown away by certain sections of the book where I was like, holy shit, like he's talking about ecological collapse and, mass environmental disasters in 1981. And I'm assuming those sections of the books were probably written in the 70s. And we're sort of there now, right to the point where the ultra rich, like at the end of the book, they're talking about, well, we've basically fucked this planet, so we're looking at off-planet exploitation now. And I'm like, okay, Elon Musk. I was like, wow. I mean, I know that stuff is, if you go back in science fiction, they've been imagining ecological disaster and since the 60s, since we knew that. It's just amazing that the rest of the world has just sat there and watched it happen over the last 40 years and done fuck all. I think it's Kurt Vonnegut who said, who's another person who's mentioned actually a few times in the plagiarism section, and even mentioned by name in the text, I think.
We haven't done a Vonnegut on this show yet, have we?
Nope. We definitely should do something that I haven't read. Vonnegut said, like, we're going to be the first civilization ever to not save itself because for financial reasons, because it's not cost effective. And so this book leans a lot into that sort of stuff in that last part.
Yeah.
I was going to say the two things I remember from this book from being younger that I remembered wrong were, one of them is the scene quite near the end of the Thaw section where he goes to a prostitute, because there's a very intense thread of sexual frustration that increases as that section of the book goes on, right? He cannot get off with a girl at all. And he also suffers from eczema. So in addition to the asthma,
which he did, right? Which he did
in real life, yeah. Which apparently was a block for him meeting girls and having relationships with people. And so that all goes wrong. But I remembered it so much more detailed. I'm worried as to why I had blown it up into a much longer, like her being like, and like a really descriptive explanation of where under his balls the eczema was and the flaking, and like, why do I couldn't believe how scanty that section was when I got to it. It was like, there's no detail at all. I brought it all.
Had you conflated it with the singing detective or something like that, maybe?
I don't know. I had this really clear image, and then also of him murdering her, which doesn't happen at all. Like, she just kicks him out. She's like, I'm not touching that. That doesn't look good. Take that out of here. And he leaves. And then, he does.
That sounds like there's a touch of Dennis Potter in your recollection.
That's just, I completely. And then the other thing that I misremembered in a way is, and another thing that I think probably bothers some people and bothered me the first time I read it. I read this in the early-ish 90s, and I wasn't really aware of meta things back then. And this book gets very meta as it goes on, right down to including the author. But at one point, the author is explaining to LANARK, you're not made of atoms. You are made of like tiny pieces of print marching along in endless lines like ants along a page. And I have never read a book before where I was completely immersed and the book just pushed me out. Because you know what happens when you're reading sometimes and suddenly you're like, oh shit, I'm not in the story anymore. I'm just reading text. But I never had a book shove me out.
And I was well on top of that say, well, actually print's made up of atoms as well anyway. So
yes, exactly. In a footnote later on, yes.
Right. So LANARK then. So I'm curious to see what you think in terms of your parallel reading experiences. But actually they're not. I don't fuck. I'm talking.
Yeah.
Anyway, so for me, I mean, so this is a difficult one because I'm really glad I read this book. I have to say, it was very overall a very pleasurable reading experience, and I can certainly see why it's developed the kind of cult that it has, really, or why. Because if nothing else, it's such a devotion of time to read the whole thing that you really do go on a journey with it, right?
Yes, it is an epic in that way.
Yeah.
So Mervyn Peake, sorry, I was going to say Mervyn Peake's the other thing. I've never read. Have you ever read Gormenghast?
No, but I have it right here, so we might want to do that.
I'm actually very interested in doing it too, and I've never read any of those either, and I think that's another good.
And we can watch another creepy TV kids thing, right? Is the TV adaptation of it?
There's a kids version. I've seen one of the adaptations many years ago. The one that has the Irish drunk in it.
Isn't that like a kind of a kids show?
Maybe it was. It seemed very dark if it was. But anyway,
the 70s or 80s or whatever it was. No. So what I was going to say. But it is if I'm trying to, it's almost a book that defies criticism. Really, because
he anticipates. He literally attempts to anticipate it before it comes, which is hilarious.
Yeah. But it's definitely worth reading, and but it is certainly. I don't think, like some people were saying. Some people think of it as some sort of like a classic book, if you see what I mean, like a great.
Okay.
I would fall short of that. I don't think it is like a. I mean, it's kind of futile to make one anyway, but if you were going to make like a canon of like the very finest literature that you must read, this wouldn't be in there, because I think across a whole bunch of other books, they would kind of do some of the same things that this does, but much more succinctly. And, so I don't think it is in the canon of fantastic, great literature, whether straight up or fantastic or anything like that. But that said, I mean, it is a hell of a reading experience, which is worth doing. But I don't know. It doesn't. I don't know. It falls short of actual. I don't think it's a work of genius.
Okay, it's not a staggering work of heartbreaking genius,
and that thing certainly fucking isn't, right? But it's certainly not.
No, I don't. I agree. And what I think about maybe it's even greater, because what might be is something that obviously that's somehow, given its massive size, still its reach is outdistanced by its grasp, whatever that saying is, right? Like that it's reaching for something that it can't quite get. It might just be the most magnificent failure ever, and for that reason it should be held up, and it should be read as something that was like, wow, he really swung for the fences with this mad pile of bollocks, and it's kind of wonderful.
And something which surprised me as well is watching the doc and in comparison with so his father specifically, and his mother to a certain degree, very much painted as autodidacts.
Yeah.
Who were in very much this working class milieu, but quite well read, and that's apparently that stuff's true. Like they were reading, I can't remember what they were reading now, but they were certainly reading stuff that you wouldn't expect people from that background to
like the collected works of Karl Marx and
stuff like that. And it might not be touched by genius, but it's like someone really kind of, I don't know, there's something of the autodidact about it, right? Like it's there's no concessions to everything's made on its own terms, right? You can't fault it for that, right? Like its failings are, I don't know.
Yeah, they're its failings.
Yes.
They wholly belong to Alasdair Gray and the mad thing that he's created. It's I was going to say I don't think it comes up in the documentary, but then I think does make sense in the terms of the book as well, is a great nostalgia for the post-war kind of welfare state version of England and Scotland and Wales, right? Where before, and in a way, the book is a kind of a raging against that Thatcherite, what comes in the 70s, right, and in the 80s, of the complete dismantling of the ladder, right, of the ladder that was being constructed. Like, you can get out of poverty if you educate yourself, if you read, if you have good libraries, you have opportunities for people who aren't born into wealth to better themselves, right?
Well, that's what I mean. And there's a thing at the end of the book as well where he talks about, he thinks a well-stocked library is like the height of a modern democratic state or something like that, right? And yes, and to your point, so that highlights what I'm saying. There's kind of a weird. So having grown up under Thatcher, I think, and beyond, where I was almost ashamed of myself that I was surprised that these people would be reading stuff like that.
Right.
Because
they're supposed to keep coal in their bathtubs, as you well know.
But also, when I think I grew up in an era where it almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that it became, people were less emboldened to, it almost, you grew up with a feeling of hopeless. Now, I mean, and I don't get me wrong, I didn't grow up in deprived circumstances or anything. But pretty much growing up, I never really thought I'm gonna get out of this and improve. You know, it felt pretty kind of, you know, the ceiling's the limit. You know, and
Right.
clearly earlier generations didn't feel like that, right? There was a bit more hope somewhere. You know,
Right.
maybe it's got something to do with, you know, emerging from a couple of world wars or something. Like, you can't get much worse than that, or, you know. But yeah, I was almost ashamed of myself for being surprised that these characters would be so well read, and
Well,
because,
so
you know, they, you know, people were, and I think something did change. I don't think I'm remembering it wrong. There's
right.
a certain death of the pride of the autodidact or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's become a lot easier for people to give up. And, well, I didn't, you know, have opportunities. I didn't go to college or something like that. You know, you think, well, what's that going to do with it? Just fucking
Go
read
to
the
the
book.
library.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's free. But so my, you know, we're going to run out of time here. We might want to give ourselves a 5-6 more minutes because this is such an sprawling book. But I'll just say, so my granddad Harton, my mom's dad, he was a carpet layer by trade, and
It did Batman.
he was not a big fan specifically of the 1960s Batman TV series. And so, you know, I understand from my mom's stories, but that my granddad Harton like grew up in proper grinding poverty, like grew up in a tenement house basically, where you had to like beat the rats off your bed, and by that I mean you know, masturbate them until they fell asleep, and then, you know, they wouldn't bother you. But no, like proper, and like fistfuls of DDT thrown on the beds in order to kill keep the bed bugs down and stuff like that, you know. And so he became a carpet layer. He went to England during World War II, like a lot of Irishmen, and worked on the railroads. And, you know, experienced the Blitz and all that stuff. Came back to Ireland, but, you know, generally speaking, was a working man. He did act.
I like how you said that. Like, he went over to England, experienced the Blitz, like almost like, they're mad over there. You wouldn't believe.
Yeah, just
it's
sitting around in the dark.
Time.
But I remember talking to my granddad about, you know, it was fascinating to have access to somebody who had lived through that stuff, you know, had lived through the Luftwaffe just bombing the chip shop road and stuff.
I remember talking to my grandfather didn't have much to say about it, but yeah, just like, because relatively near where I grew up, like the city of Swansea was entirely destroyed. Right. I mean, there's almost none of Swansea left.
Because it was an industrial center, right?
Yeah.
But then, I mean, again, you would be more likely to know people who are actually veterans, or possibly have extended family who'd actually gone and fought. But, you know, Ireland, because it was neutral, in just sent men to work in England while all of the Englishmen were off getting shot in the trenches, or, you know, in Africa.
Well, my people were cleverly farmers, so they didn't have to go off to fight either. So
good idea. So anyway, so my granddad was like incredibly well read. I said he was also actually an actor, like a stage actor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so was my grandmother. They may have even met through that. They may have met through acting. I've got a great photograph of my granny on stage as Aladdin when she's like in her later teenage years, like with like pants and a fez, and it's
maybe cool. We found the source of maybe he auditioned for Batman and didn't get it.
There we go. Yes, he could have auditioned for Steptoe. Actually, my granddad was often called Steptoe by people.
Fond of pickled onions, was he?
He was. So yeah, but anyway, he was very much an autodidact. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much of secondary school he may have finished. Secondary school, he may not. My mom would know, but definitely, you know, it read his entire life and was hugely knowledgeable on a variety of subjects. Would sit down with him and watch, you know, quiz shows and stuff, and just be astonished by, you know, his recall of all kinds of shit. So yeah, so to me, the idea of being very poor, but also being very much an intellect, you know, somebody, it was not strange. And then, you know, generationally, obviously, we've all moved up, right? My I mean, his sons, like my uncle Matty, became a professor of engineering at Trinity College, or Bolton Street, maybe originally, and then maybe Trinity. Anyway, whatever. So yeah, and he was, reading was a big part of, I guess, that side of my family. Slightly less so on the Sheehan side, but definitely on the Harton side. And yeah, I don't know. It seems to me like again, but you can only do that if your government pays for libraries, if your government offers opportunities for people who are bright and interested to maybe have a chance of doing something. I mean, again, that comes through again, like the arts need to be supported if people are going to be able to work in the arts. I mean, where the fuck we're going to be with all of this AI, like where the computers are now doing the writing and the drawing and the humans are just drudging in shit jobs. I don't know. It's slightly terrifying.
Let's get off this grumpy old man.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's get back to what you thought of the book then and what you thought of the book now.
Okay, so as I said, I think then I was really interested in all of the stuff about being a young man who has a strong vision of wanting to make art and great art, but also reading comics and masturbating to them. And
I wonder
really,
why that might
be. Really wanting a girlfriend intensely. Really wanting a girlfriend intensely, but not quite sure how to get one. And yeah, also obviously, and resenting girls fiercely for not falling down at your feet and worshiping you upon meeting you and seeing in you the glowing soul of the artist.
How little has changed.
So all that stuff was like manna for me at that age, and the book was also where the book fell in that course. So this was a course I took in like post-war British literature, beginning with the Angries, right, Sillitoe and the rest of them, John Osborne, and then going through the Margaret Drabble and stuff. And so this was a book nearer to the end, right, because by this we're talking the 90s, and this book is 81, right? So this is one of the last books we read for the course, and I was like, what the fuck is this thing? Like, not just because it's massive, but also because, as I said, it literally, as you said, it starts to break apart. It's like the book is like shaking by the end of it, like right. it's falling to pieces.
Yeah. Under its own weight.
yeah, almost like the spine has broken. And so, I was I loved the middle, was less convinced by the stuff on the either side. But as I said, coming back this time, I had far more sympathy and interest in what he was attempting to do overall, and was much more annoyed by both Lanark and Thaw. I was like, why did I think this character was awesome? He's a fucking idiot. He doesn't know how to love. And the book it's in there. We're directly told he's a very poor human being who doesn't understand how to love people or himself. And yet I was immediately...
you have to have the eyes to see these things, right?
Right. And I suppose you're always primed as a reader to identify, I mean, a point which the author makes at one point where he tells Thaw directly, I guess I can't, maybe I shouldn't kill you and your child because the audience, the readers don't give a shit about me. They care about you because you're their entry into this world, and maybe I shouldn't end the book the way I have planned.
It's interesting as well that you have returned to this book. I don't think I will ever read this book again.
Okay.
Like, it feels like such a monumental one-time read for me. I'm not sure if I would. I don't know. Get
but 25-year intervals, 30-year intervals seems about right. So maybe I'll come back.
I see that, but I don't know. I just like I said, I don't know if there's. I think I got most of the meat off the bone.
That makes sense. At the age you're at, you're kind of between,
right.
Yeah. So, but my interest is maybe moving forward is trying those other two, Poor Things and 1982 Justine.
Yeah. No, I agreed. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if there's much.
Nope. I think we're done. This is
just we've talked around it and we've talked quite a lot. And I don't think we should probably talk anymore. It's probably
agreed. If you're from Glasgow, you should probably read this, and you should probably go try to see a couple of Alasdair Gray's murals while they still are extant, because murals don't always last. So
One thing I would say, the one thing that slightly annoyed me about that documentary, the Alasdair Gray at 80,
Mhm.
it was because of when it was made. They kept trying to tie it in to
The Scottish the vote.
independence vote,
Mhm.
and I was like, this has nothing to like.
Yeah, and even Alasdair Gray was having none of it, which was
Yeah,
which was
like,
hilarious.
don't co-opt this with that. That was.
Mhm.
Because it wasn't a great doc, but it was quite enjoyable. So I'm glad it got made. But it
Yeah.
was slightly annoying that they kept coming back to that again and
Yes,
again.
I did like where they're like, you know, is
Like
this an
nothing, like no,
epical moment in history? And he's like, no,
yeah,
it's
no,
not.
what do you want about? Yeah, it's almost like choose any other case at random. It's almost as if, and that reminds us that the consumption of cream cakes daily is important, and I think that's what Alasdair Gray is saying. What the
Mhm.
fuck are you talking about cream cake? Like, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that was quite
All right.
annoying. Anyway, let us
Interesting
away.
book. Interesting book. If you've got a spare couple of months, you know,
Well,
you give it
definitely worth the read. I think certainly.
Okay. With that.
Mm.